first-time guest on the podcast, Chris Kocher, is here to talk about his new book, Thank You for the Days. Fans of the Kinks Share 60 Years of Stories. Chris, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be here with you.
What a great idea for a book, one that's told from a fan's perspective. What led to the idea?
I've been a fan of the Kinks for, about 30 years, and I've been involved in the online Kinks community for almost that long. So I've heard a lot of amazing stories over that time. And I remember at one point I had this vague idea that these stories would make a great documentary, but I don't know anything about making films. I don't have those skills. So that idea just kind of died off. But the real main inspiration for the book was in early 2023, the Kinks had a private event in London where they kicked off the celebrations for the 60th year of the band. And Ray Davis, Dave Davis, Mick Avery, the three original guys from the band who are still with us, were all there. A lot of fans and friends were there. And I read about it online, and I was kind of jealous, to be honest. I mean, I thought, man, wouldn't it have been cool to have been there? But then I started thinking, well, what could I do to kind of mark the 60th anniversary of such an amazing, seminal band in rock and roll? It's such a huge milestone. I'm a writer, I'm an editor, so that's kind of where my brain goes. And, there have been a lot of great books about the Kinks over the years. Ray and Dave have each written 2 autobiographies. There have been biographies written by other people. Other books have analyzed the music from the lyrics to the cultural content of it, especially, in the context of Britain in the 1960s and how the Kinks fit into all of that. But I'm thinking, what can I do that's different? What hasn't been done yet? For a while in my career, I ran the editorial page of the daily newspaper here in Binghamton, New York, where I'm from. And you might think that's kind of a thankless job. And in some ways, frankly, it was kind of a thankless job. But one thing that I really enjoyed was the process of letters to the editor and op-ed pieces, like taking somebody who isn't a professional writer, they're submitting something, and I work on it with them to help make it publishable. So that's kind of where my brain went. And I also tend to gravitate toward projects that give other people a chance to shine. That's just kind of how I am. I want to boost other people, give them chances that maybe they wouldn't have. So I realized there had been no real organized effort to collect Kinks fan stories. So my brain started going in that direction, and I ran the idea past a few Kinks friends, and they agreed it would be a cool thing to do. I thought maybe it would be a self-published book, but I decided to pitch it to a few publishers of music books. Luckily, Stephen Lamb from Sonic Bond said, it's not the kind of thing we usually publish, but let's do it. So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Stephen for giving this book a chance. Again, it's not like anything else Sonic Bond has ever done. So hopefully I won't let him down.
You get a lot of these stories that come from online, people that you already knew online. How did you get all of these stories put together?
I kind of put the word out. As I mentioned, I've been part of the Kinks fan community online for longer than there have been pictures on the internet. Let's put it that way. So, back in the day when it was only text. So,
well, is there a main website? Because I know as a Van Halen fan, there's VH Links is the big one where you can go and all the fans are there. Is there one that you can go to and you put the word out and you get tons of stories that come your way?
Yeah, the best ones that I did, there are several good Facebook groups for Kinks fans that I posted the information to, but mainly there's a wonderful fan, his name is Dave Emlin, who runs a website called kindakinks.net, which is the big fan site that's on the internet. It's been there, again, for years and years and years. And Dave's a great guy. And I went to Dave. He was one of the ones that I mentioned the book idea to. And I said, would you mind if we hosted all of the submission info on your website? Because I didn't want to have to repeat everything over and over again, like on all the Facebook groups and everything else. So it was just easier to say, go to this link, read what it's all about, and make it easier that way. And Dave said, sure, I'd love to do that. And a lot of people found it that way. or through social media. But yeah, as you said, I mean, a lot of them are people that I've known for many years. I've heard some of their stories, but still had some really amazing stories to tell that I didn't know about. And it was great to collect all those and get them ready for publication. I mean, and I say this with love. Some of them, their English was not their first language, so that was kind of interesting. I say it with love because I only speak English. So anybody who can speak more than one language
Yeah.
is doing much better than I am.
Yeah.
I don't know how their brains work that way. So it took some work, but a lot of them, they're all very incredible stories.
They really are. There's some heartwarming stories. There's some funny stories. There's a wide range. You did say you didn't want it to read like a laundry list. You mentioned that in the introduction. So just talk about how it's laid out.
I wanted to avoid entries that were something like, yeah, I saw him at this venue in 1968, and then I saw him again in 1972, and then in 1979. And I thought, man, that's going to be boring over a whole book. Like, I wouldn't want to read a book like that because there's no real heart to it. It's more like a laundry list of different times where I've seen a band, and this is when I bought this album. But I want to know why you bought that album. One of the things that I really took inspiration from was something that National Public Radio here in the United States, NPR, in the early 2000s, they did a thing that was called the National Story Project. One of my favorite authors, Paul Auster, who sadly left us earlier this year, was involved in that project. And they asked listeners to send the one remarkable story from their lives, like the most amazing story that they had. And Paul would select them and read them on the air. And there were so many great stories about mysterious and unknowable forces that kind of control our everyday lives. Paul Auster's books are very much about coincidence, and they're very much about the power of these forces that just kind of come into our lives and steer us in ways that we never expected, things that happen to just ordinary people. And later, Paul Auster edited them into a book that I would highly recommend. It was called I Thought My Father Was God, which was based on one of the stories that's in the book. So kind of inspired by that a little bit, I said to people, give me your one defining story from your time as a Kinks fan. Tell me about how you became a fan, or about a concert that changed your life, or how you met a soulmate or a friend because of the music. Maybe they met a band member, but they didn't necessarily have to. I mean, a lot of the stories in the book are about meeting various members of the band in some way or another, but it didn't have to be like that. It was whatever they felt was the story that they could tell was their best story. And I asked everybody to pin their story down to a particular year, a specific year, so that I could put everything in chronological order, because that seemed like a good way to organize things. Like, otherwise it'd be a little chaotic. So, you go from 1960s, 1980s, 1970s, so at least if I'm asking for one defining story, then it would have to be pinned to a particular year. And that way I can put them in a chronological order, and it'd be sort of read like an oral history of the band almost.
Well, let's go back to the year you became a Kinks fan. How did you become a fan?
My path to becoming a fan, and I don't really get into this in the book, but I had a really good friend in high school in the late 80s, early 90s, who was a big fan, talked about the Kinks a lot, but he never really sat me down to make me listen to the songs. And I really wish he had back in the day. Things might have been very different for a lot of parts of my life. So it wasn't really until around 1995 or so that I really finally bought a few albums on my own and I got into them. I'm an unrepentant Anglophile in other parts of my life. So the Kinks really fit right into that part of my brain where, I really like British culture and British TV and all of that stuff. I mean, a lot of my favorite other songwriters and authors and TV shows are all British. So it all kind of plugs in there.
Yeah, I always feel like the Kinks are among those bands. When you become a fan of rock and roll, there are the essentials. The Kinks are one of those bands you have to listen to, and if you do, you will embrace them. For me, I got on probably early to mid 80s because of MTV, Come Dancing, the videos, right. And then I think I got the best of that had the live version of You Really Got Me, which I was blown away by. there were fans that came along going back to the 60s right through up until probably today. I'm sure there are kids and grandkids who are listening to the music. Going back to the early years, we go back to 64 to 69. So many great stories. And there's one from a fan who didn't just get to meet Kinks' original member and bassist. Is Pete Quaife. Is that how you pronounce? Yeah, yes. It's Quaife.
Pete Quaife.
Pete came to her home. Share this story from Olga Ruoko of Essex, UK. And this takes place on Friday, November 12th, 1965, which I love the exact dates too. It's really cool.
Well, Olga is one of the great longtime Kinks fans in the UK. I call her Dame Olga because she's really one of the fans who's been around the longest. But more importantly, in my mind, she's one of the friendliest and most helpful fans you'll ever meet. She kept great journals and diaries back in the day. That's how she can specifically say November 12th, 1965, because I'm sure she still has all of her diaries from back in the day. When I first came into Kinks fandom, I was in my mid-20s, and some of the longtime fans weren't always friendly to the young and eager punks like I was at that point. But Olga has always been kind, always been gracious. She would go to UK album signings and pick me up an extra copy and mail it to me,
that's awesome.
And, stuff like that. And when I thought about putting together the book, I mentioned earlier that I had talked to some Kinks fans about whether it was a good idea or not. I thought of them as my unofficial council of advisors. And Olga was on it along with some other trusted fans to help advise and give ideas about how I could generate entries for the book. So Olga has known all the Kinks pretty much from the beginning. So
she's a treasure for Kinks fans.
You could make a whole book of stories from Olga. I mean, really. Like, I've heard some of them. I'm sure there are many of them I haven't heard. But, the one that is in the book, as you mentioned, is about how original bassist Pete Quaife for the Kinks knew where she lived from getting the fan letters that she used to send to him, and just showed up at her house one time and had tea with her and her mother. Like, there was a knock on the door and she thought, oh, well, maybe it's somebody from the Kinks who were here to see me. Ha, ha, ha. And it turned out it really was Pete Quaife.
Wow.
And I don't even know if there was an official fan club at that point. There might have been, but somehow she figured out how to get in touch with all of them.
Wow.
And would have letter exchanges with him for his entire life, that she would trade letters with him. Even after he left the band in the late 60s, they all kept in touch. But when they're having tea together, again, she remembers all of this because I think she must have written it down at the time. They talk about all the band's adventures touring around the world in 1965, which was really the year that the Kinks became international. But it was just like he was stopping at a friend's house for a social call. Wow. And they were friends in a lot of ways. I mean, her and Ray and Dave and Mick are still friends to this day. It's a bond that hasn't really weakened in the 60 years since they have known each other.
What a different time when a band can be that close to their fans. Nowadays, I don't know if you can. It's more you get closer to them through social media, and the members of the bands can communicate with their fans that way. But there's a lot of safety precautions now, and you got to get through the bodyguards. And
it is fun to think about those early days of rock and roll where everything was still kind of innocent in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
That, you could just have a Kink just show up to your house and have tea with you and your mom. And it's amazing to think about. And of course, London was not a huge city. So he probably lived just down the road and he showed up on his Vespa and just was a friend to her.
When did the Kinks get their first hit single? Was it around 65?
You Really Got Me came out in August 64, I believe.
Okay.
So 65 was when they really broke internationally, like in America, and they did their tour of America that turned out to not go very well. And that's how they ended up getting banned in America for a few years. But they still toured around the world, other parts of the world, and based on You Really Got Me and All Day and All the Night. And, a lot of those early hits took them
Tired of Waiting
everywhere.
For You. Yeah, they were not an unknown band when this guy was in her house drinking tea.
No.
Yeah. No. When I think of pirate radio, I think of the Kinks too. When you think of pirate radio at the height of its powers, just for those who may not be familiar, the UK allowed only state-controlled radio from the 20s through the mid-60s. But then by the 60s, the post-war baby boom filled the UK with millions of teenagers who were eager to hear the rock and roll records that the BBC declined to play. And one of them was A Fan Who Makes Your Book. Again, help with the pronunciation here. Ruud Kirsteins.
Ruud, yeah.
I got it right. From the Netherlands.
Yep,
has a story from 1968. He starts with, quote, "Some events in your life leave an indelible impression. For me, it was the first performance of the Kinks that I attended. I was 17 years old, still living at home and listening to the pirate radio stations that broadcast from the North Sea, Radio Veronica, Radio Nordsee, Radio London, and many more. That's how I first heard the music that I continue to love to this day. Most importantly, the Kinks." And then he goes on to tell a story, takes him backstage in the Kinks dressing room. I'll leave it to you to take it from there. Share this story.
Yeah, before I share that, I just want to say one interesting thing is that submissions for the book were obviously open to anybody anywhere in the world, but they came from three main countries: the UK, obviously, the US, and the Netherlands. I mean, there are so many passionate Kinks fans in the Netherlands. I mean, fun fact, the band had more number one hits in the Netherlands than in the UK.
Really?
So, yeah, there are so many great Kinks fans in the Netherlands, and Ruud is just one of them. Ruud managed to talk his way backstage in 1968 at a concert because he managed to strike up a conversation in the bar with a journalist who was sent there to interview the band. Now, the journalist didn't know which Kink was which. He was still learning who was who in the band. So Ruud offered to help him and said, "Take me backstage with you, and I'll point out which one's Ray, which one's Dave, which one's Mick." And together, Ruud and this journalist got to meet the original lineup with Ray and Dave and Mick and Pete Quaife. And Ruud happened to have his camera with him and got some really amazing candid photos in the dressing room of them just hanging out and, before the show. And, I think somebody's having a smoke and, it's just, I mean, there are a couple of photos in the book that Ruud took from that.
That's a scene out of a movie right there.
Yeah, it's great. And then eventually the bodyguard or somebody from the venue realized Ruud's not really a professional journalist and really shouldn't be in there. He's only a 17-year-old kid who has a camera. So there are several stories in the book about fans kind of sneaking their way backstage when they probably shouldn't have been there. And there's even one fan who managed to sneak his way into Cox Studios, which is the North London studio where a lot of the Kinks records were made. And he just kind of talked his way in there until somebody realized he really shouldn't be in there. And he got asked to leave. I don't know that I could be that bold, that I could talk my way into it. I would get nervous and I would blow it like within the first 10 seconds. But these people must be much more cool than me.
Recently, I had someone tell me a journalist tell me a story about he would go to the Fillmore in San Francisco and he would bring a guitar case with him and pretend he was with the band. And they'd let him go right in, go right backstage.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing. Mm-hmm. Let's go to the 70s now. There was a dip in popularity in the late 60s for the Kinks, but then they start the 70s off with Lola, and they are back on top, and that's one of their most iconic songs. There are stories in the book that speak to how the Kinks saved teenagers from difficult home lives. Lynn Killam from North Carolina shares a story of seeing the band in 1971. This is the first of 40 Kinks concerts she went to, and she writes, quote, "The Kinks enriched my New York City years. I think they saved me from an alcoholic parent and the stressors of late adolescence. The music, which I played repeatedly until the vinyl was potato chip thin, was complex yet straightforward. Ray's voice could change from a soft lilt to a roar as he switched up musical styles on every song. The Kinks' music was original and magical, and so were their concerts."
Obviously, one of the great things about music is how it lets us escape from our lives for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. I mean, sometimes that's driving to work or walking in the park or doing mindless everyday tasks. I'm willing to do almost any stupid mindless task as long as there's a song. I'll wash the dishes. I'll do some ridiculous task at work that I don't necessarily want to do that's repetitive. As long as I got a tune on, I'm into it. I'll get through it. But
I can't imagine a life without music.
yeah,
Can't imagine.
yeah.
Well, is there a Kinks song if you're down and you need to listen to some Kinks music to pick you up? You got any song or songs that come to mind that will always do it for you?
There's a lot of great upbeat songs, like something like "Do It Again" or
Oh, Do It Again's
something.
great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great song to kind of pump you up a little bit. Yeah, that's an energetic song that has a great message of, sometimes you have to keep going. You just have to. There's a lot of great songs that Ray Davis wrote that are about keep going until you fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
Just keep going.
Well, I'll tell you, I mentioned Van Halen, and Van Halen was huge fans of the Kinks. In fact, during their club days, they had like 20 of their songs they would play. That
Yeah.
they, Where Have All the Good Times Gone was
Yeah.
not just You Really Got Me, but Where Have All the Good Times Gone, they opened their Diver Down album with from 1982. And then you have You Really Got Me. Funny stories about that, too, where Dave, he handled it well because it was at one point people just thought Van Halen was the band who wrote You Really Got Me. And fans would come up to the Kinks in the late 70s like, hey, you guys did a great cover of Van Halen's You Really Got Me, and Dave's just like, yeah, okay. Okay.
There's a great live album from 1980 that's called One for the Road.
Yes.
And there's a reason why there are songs on there like You Really Got Me and others that had been covered by other people around that time. And it was almost like the Kinks were reclaiming those songs for themselves a little bit, reminding people that they were the ones who wrote them.
Sure.
But from what I've read, and you would know more as a big Van Halen fan, but they used to play like entire sides of like the Kinks' greatest hits album.
K-Tel Kinks' greatest hits, I think David Lee Roth said they owned or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How about fans who went to extremes to just get to a Kinks show? Julie Evelsizer from Alabama saw the band in 1975. She was 19. She couldn't drive, had no money. Her and a friend scrapped enough money together to travel by bus to Mississippi to see the band. And she says, quote, we arranged to stay at the shabby motel across from the bus station and walk to the venue. It was a small place down near the river. Members of the Children of God cult hung around outside. And when we told them the story of our trip from Tuscaloosa, they said they could use such devotion in their group. That's hardcore. Any other stories like that from the book that stand out for you?
There are some really good stories about fans going to extreme lengths to get to concerts. The one that sticks out to me is one from a guy named Stephen Burgess, who drove with his wife and a couple of friends through Virginia in 16 inches of snow. Now, of course, Virginia of 16 inches of snow is like 8 feet of snow.
Oh my God.
In the Northeast. Like, I don't know how they got through, but this was in early 1982. And they had all kinds of car trouble along the way. What should have been a 4.5-hour car drive ended up taking them about 10 hours to get to where they wanted to go, which was also in Virginia. So it wasn't even in a different state. They got there just in time for the end of the concert. Luckily, they managed to see something like 12 songs because the Kinks did a whole bunch of encores at the end. So they still managed to see a good number of songs, but it's just crazy. Like, they had engine trouble and, they're driving through the snow and
hardcore,
ridiculous
man.
Hardcore.
Yes.
Again, like maybe more hardcore than I would be. I would have to think that maybe the roads in Virginia after 16 inches of snow, because they don't know what to do in Virginia when it snows, or North Carolina or anywhere in the South. They freak out.
Chris Kocher is here to talk about his new book, Thank You for the Days Fans of the Kinks Share 60 Years of Stories. A late 70s show that highlights, I always say Ray Davies, but it's Ray Davis, right? That's the...
Ray Davis, although, Ray Davies is very commonly heard as well.
This late 70s show, it highlights Ray's sense of humor. He came out in a Nixon mask.
Well, during the rock opera era of the Kinks, which was around the mid-70s, they did an album that was called Schoolboys in Disgrace. And there was a character in that. It was based in a boys' school where there was a big scandal. One of the boys gets a girl pregnant and basically gets expelled from the school. There was a character in the story that was called the Headmaster. He had a big number that was called The Hard Way. And it was basically a whole song about how the boy who got the girl pregnant was useless and was getting thrown out of school. And Ray would come out wearing like a headmaster mask for that song. I think that's maybe what one fan is remembering as a Nixon mask. It is kind of like a big exaggerated, wrinkly mask. I mean, I didn't change it from a Nixon mask. I almost did, to be honest, but I didn't because I wasn't there. So maybe he did come out in a Nixon mask. I have to think maybe he's remembering his headmaster mask, which may have been a Nixon mask. I've seen pictures of it, but not very close up. But there were just outrageous moments like that happened. I mean, I feel like the sense of humor that is part of the Kinks is really something that appeals to a lot of fans. I like to say about my own endeavors, the things that I do in my own life, they're serious about the work, but they're not always serious about how they do it.
The story of how Graham Morford of Plymouth, UK, scored a ticket to a show in March of '84 is so great.
It really is a cool story. He works at a construction site in London, and he just spontaneously decides he's going to clock out of his job for the afternoon. He tells a coworker to tell the boss that he's going to see his accountant. I don't know if that's some kind of British joke that, like I need to go see a man about a dog. I don't know if you know that one, but
yeah,
but he decides he's going to go to see this Kinks show in Guildford, which is maybe an hour train ride from London. He doesn't have a ticket, but he thinks that there will be some extra tickets on sale when he gets there. He made a call ahead of time, and they told him at the box office that there might be some extra tickets available. So when he gets there, it turns out there aren't any extra tickets after all. He's sad about it, and he decides he's already in Guildford. He might as well hang around backstage, like the stage door during the sound check. So he hears the sound check through the stage door. He gets to hear a couple of songs. So it's not really a wasted trip. So while he's waiting there, members of the band start coming out the back door after the sound check. Ray comes out, and there's a road manager who's handing out tickets to some German fan club members who had made some prior arrangement to come to the show. The road manager had all their tickets, and he's handing them out. And Graham really wants one of those tickets, man. Like, I can just see him there like, man, how do I get one of those? So he pulls out this ultimate ace card, which I love, but he was clearly reluctant to use. And he tells Ray, your dad and my grandpa were best friends. And it turns out to be true. And when he tells him his grandpa's name, Ray remembers him. And Ray's like, oh, yeah, how's your granddad doing? And unfortunately, his granddad had died a few years previously to that. But Ray says, hey, give this guy a ticket.
Wow.
And, that's how Graham gets a ticket to the show. Graham's grandpa, if there's a great gig in the sky, which I like to think there is, I like to think Grandpa was smiling down at Graham and being like, good job, boy. You used all your connections on that one, and you made it happen.
Hooked him up from heaven. Into the 90s now, a frightening story from Igor Znidarczyk. I believe I got it right, from the Netherlands. He talks about seeing the Kinks on August 15th, 1990, and it could have been the last Kinks concert he ever went to.
Yeah, this is kind of a scarier story. Igor found himself in a pretty bad situation, actually. There was an outdoor concert in this large town square, but it clearly wasn't large enough for the crowd that ended up showing up. And the crush of people got really intense. And Igor was worried that he might end up a rock and roll casualty, really. It sounds like it was a poorly planned event from the promoters or the town or whoever organized the whole thing. And there were barricades that were set up, and it was just crowding everybody in. I remember when I was a kid, this is a side story, but when I was a kid, I was in a similar crowd like that once, and I understand the panic. I was at like a county fair that had gotten too crowded. There was a bottleneck in a particular part of the fair. People were pushing, and it was scary,
Sure.
So
well,
I
the Cincinnati
the panic,
Who concert.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, luckily I was not in that kind of situation,
right.
But yeah.
But that's how bad it can get.
Absolutely. I mean, these things have happened. That's the most famous example, but obviously there are others. He manages to get out safely because somehow he has a card on him that shows that he's a journalist. He writes for not even a music magazine, but he managed to pull this card out of his jacket and hold it up and be like, I'm press, let me through, And somehow everybody parts, and he manages to get out of that chaos and get out of there safely. And everybody else was safe eventually anyway. Probably soon afterward, the promoters realized what happened and tried to fix it. But the end of the story is Igor says to his friend, dying at a Kinks concert, it could be worse.
Sure. that's not a bad way to go.
And they're trying to decide what song they'd like to hear, as their last song.
Yes.
So it's funny to laugh at in hindsight, but I'm sure at the time it was really stressful and scary. It could have been a lot more tragic, but in hindsight, it was kind of funny for them.
I think he was saying too, he wrote for the weekly newspaper, and I think he just covered like town hall meetings and stuff. That was, that was it.
Like that, yeah.
But he's like, I'm with the press.
Yeah, I'm with the media. Let me through. And in 1990, there was still enough trust in the media that would actually work. Now people would just go, get lost, and hang him the finger or whatever, or they shove him harder. Maybe I don't know.
Exactly.
The kind of crowd that he's in. But.
Yeah. Let's get to the photos. There's a few I want to ask you about. One is from Ruud Kirstein's, and it says it's from May 68 at the concert in the Netherlands. It looks like they're playing in a classroom.
Yeah.
You can see the chalkboard behind them, right?
Yeah. We talked a little bit about Ruud's experience earlier. I mean, those were photos that he took during the concert, like after he got thrown out of the dressing room, when he snuck his way back there to get photos. He took some photos during the concert. I'm not really sure of the size of that venue. I did actually send Ruud an email to ask him, but you have to keep in mind that the Kinks by 1968 or so had lost some of their audience for various reasons. I mean, they weren't selling their singles as well. They had become more of an album kind of act in some ways, but many people still thought of them as a singles act. In the UK around that time, I know they were playing shows on the cabaret circuit because in some ways they were somehow already kind of an oldies act, even though they had only been around for 4 or 5 years at that point. The irony, of course, about that is it was 68 when they were recording some of their best music, like the Kinks of the Village Green Preservation Society album,
right?
The Arthur album, that were amazing pieces of music, and they've been rediscovered since then. But at the time, they weren't really selling like the earlier hits were selling, because it's the classic, I don't hear a single on this album,
right?
So they weren't selling the singles, so the albums weren't selling, and they weren't getting the support from the record company. And to circle back to the photos that Ruud took, I'm really glad that he sent those in and that they're in the book, because I imagine a lot of venues wouldn't have allowed photos like that. But Ruud had already taken photos in the dressing room.
Yeah.
So he was bold. He was bold as a 17-year-old. So he probably didn't care. He's like, I'm just going to snap some photos anyway. I imagine a lot of the photos have been lost to time just because people have died or lost them, or there's a flood or there's a fire, or, they move 15 times and they lost them somewhere along the way in the last 50 years. But I'm really glad that Ruud sent those photos and that we have those photos of a concert from the 60s from the Kinks, which for many fans, especially UK fans, were really like the heyday of the Kinks, the best period of the band.
Another one just below that one is Rich Tannenbaum. He's got a mural outside of his dorm room.
Rich decided to paint some artwork inspired by that Kinks album that I mentioned earlier, Schoolboys in Disgrace, which has an album cover where the headmaster is disciplining the student. The album cover is actually the student pulling down his pants or trousers, depending on if you're in the UK or the US, or both in this case, and getting spanked for his indiscretions. That picture from Rich is sort of inspired by that. It's not exactly the album cover, but it's inspired by that. I can't imagine what his school thought about that one. Like when he moved out, did he have to pay some kind of fee to have it painted over?
Right.
I mean, did they leave it for the next students? It's an interesting choice to put up as a mural in your dorm, but it is amazing to me, how fans manage to show their love for the band, even in absence of like official merchandise, posters or things that might have been harder to get even in the 70s. People found a way to show their fandom. And of course, now people get tattoos
Yeah.
That's another way to kind of show your fandom in a different way.
That wouldn't be
Yeah,
a bad
it's a great
tattoo.
photo.
That
No,
album cover. It's a great album cover. It's a
no,
cartoon.
no. Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
would start some discussions.
Yeah. Well, I've seen discussions of, unfortunately, online, what are some of the worst album covers in rock? And I've seen that one on some of them, and I don't agree. I mean, it's amusing in that it keeps with the spirit of the album. The Kinks made a heartfelt yet amusing album about an indiscretion in a public school, but the Kinks are not known for having the best album cover sometimes. So I kind of like that one myself.
I do. Yeah, I always love hearing about a young fan of a band who's been around for a long time. Evan Spellman of Kirkland, Washington was 8 years old when his mom took him from Colorado to Massachusetts to see Dave Davis play. And it doesn't end with the show. Evan and his mom got a huge surprise after the show.
Yeah, I mean, Evan was a very lucky young man. I think we can agree on that. His mom is Marianne Spellman, who I've known in the Kinks fandom for a long time. She also has a story in the book. She actually took two of the photos that you see on the cover of the book, the ones from the 1980s. And the story of how she took those photos is her story in the book. She's an amazing photographer, a longtime fan and friend of the Kinks. She's gotten a lot of concert photos from them and many other people over the years. She lives in Seattle area now and actually had an exhibit recently of many of her concert photos from over the years. But because she knew the Kinks well, she always managed to get a little bit closer to the stage than maybe some other people did.
Yeah.
But
now this one's early 2000s. I think this story takes place.
Right. This story from Evan is early 2000s. And Evan tells a great story from his perspective as a young kid who has grown up with Kinks music all around him, but hasn't ever really seen a live show. I mean, by the early 2000s, the Kinks were no longer touring as a band. Ray and Dave Davis were touring separately. His mom takes him to a show to see Dave perform at a small club. He even gets to go backstage afterward and meet Dave, meet the band, steal food from the craft table. The band laughs at him because he's like eating all the ham slices or whatever. Yeah. And he's a little baffled by the whole thing because he's just a kid, and he's got all these adult friends of his mom hanging around, and we might think his mom's friends are cool, but, he's 8.
Yeah.
So he's kind of like, nah, they're cool, but, I don't quite know what to make of this whole situation. And he tells the story very well about how he had an amazing time at the show and yet was still from that 8-year-old perspective of going to a rock and roll show, maybe for the first time, and seeing somebody on stage that he had only ever seen in pictures.
Yeah.
And he kind of says, oh, look, Dave's real. He's a real guy. Check it out. And we've all had those moments with some of our favorite bands, I'm sure, where, you go to see them for the first time and they're real. They're up there. That's really Bruce Springsteen, or that's really Van Halen, or that's really Billy Joel, or whoever. You kind of know that they're real, but that's the moment where you realize those are actual people making actual music. Yeah. And that's an amazing moment.
Yeah. He's now late 20s, 30, early 30s now.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. He's got that story to tell. And then there's a story of meeting Ray Davis in 2010. This is from fan Steve Goldstein, Redondo Beach, California. Now, here's a guy who had been to over 60 Kinks shows since 1975, as well as numerous solo gigs by Ray. This, I would think, topped all of those experiences. Could you share this story?
Steve and his wife, Jennifer, bid on a charity auction to get a backstage meeting with Ray after the concert. Steve does not say how much he paid for this experience, but he won the auction. So he must have spent a good chunk of change, I would think. They got to have a nice chat with Ray and they got some photos together. But to me, the most important moment is Steve got to tell the man himself, thank you for writing the soundtrack of my life. How many times have we wanted to meet the musicians that we really love and to be able to tell them that in that moment? I mean, that's an amazing moment to get to be able to do that. I'm sure it was worth every penny that he gave to charity in order to do that. Fans didn't need to have a personal meeting with anyone from the band to be in the book, but there are a bunch of great encounters like that one where people get a chance to say thanks directly to folks whose music has meant so much to them. And those moments really touched my heart. They were some of the ones that I really love reading. When those came into the inbox, I thought, this is exactly what I had in mind when I decided to do this book.
How many times have you seen the Kinks? Ray, Dave solo? How many shows have you been to?
Here's my confession to you, Eric, that I don't admit to many people. I have never seen a Kinks show live because I usually say I have a weird kind of bad luck. Once I really get into something, it kind of is like the last few years of whatever that thing is. So by the time I discovered the Kinks in the early mid 90s, they were kind of winding down.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's why I'm not too surprised. Yeah, they haven't toured a whole lot.
Right. I mean, 1996 was their last official show together. So I never got the chance to see them live. They spent many years saying, oh, there's going to be a reunion. Of course, that never really materialized for various reasons over the years. I really wish it had, but I get now that they're both older gentlemen now and they deserve to enjoy their retirement at this point.
Sure.
Not everybody can be a Paul McCartney or a Bruce Springsteen and still be out there and doing it for 2 or 3 hours a night.
It's very rare.
So yeah,
I hope they get along these days. I don't know the specifics of their battles over the years, but I would hope that
they seem to have come to an understanding in the last few years based on photos that we've seen or reports that we've gotten from them. I mean, I imagine it's gotten better in that they don't have to tour together anymore because obviously, as we know from many rock and roll stories from various bands, things get a little crazy on tour where you are going from city to city. You don't maybe even know what city you're in that day. And you're stuck with the same people for days, weeks, months at a time. And things can get a little tense, to say the least. That's where people throw TVs out the window or, you know, all the classic stories of band shenanigans. And the Kinks were certainly known for their fights and shenanigans over the years. But honestly, that just seems to be part and parcel of being on the road and delivering that kind of energy to the fans is, you know, once the stage lights go down, you still got all this leftover energy. What are you going to do with it?
It seems to be rare that brothers can continue and work together for a long period. I think Alex and Eddie Van Halen is a rare story because Oasis, Black Crowes, the Robinson brothers, the Davis brothers with the Kinks, seems to be that way. But I don't know, is it over creative differences? Was it one of those, this is my band, I call the shots? No, it's my band, I call the shots type of thing?
I mean, to be fair, they did last 30 years together. So that's true. That's longer than a lot of marriages.
So it was just time.
But I think that a lot of it was creative differences. And a lot of it was also the fact that they, as a band, were not getting the attention that they had gotten in the past from their record label or from the general listening public. I mean, there's always going to be a core of Kinks fans, and I'm obviously one of them, who will follow them wherever they go. But you have to keep in mind, like the last Kinks album came out in 1993. I mean, there was no way that a band that had been around for 30 years was going to compete with grunge or the other stuff that was going on at the time. It's unfortunate that it was like that, but that's just part and parcel of, you know, the highs and lows of public taste, in my opinion.
Especially when you're around 60 years, there's going to be ups and downs.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, add another 30 years onto that, and, you know, we're still in that period. But I feel like they kind of didn't feel the support that they had gotten from the record label in the past, and they just decided it was kind of time. There was no official breakup. Like there was no press release that said we are no longer a band. They just kind of stopped touring together, and Ray went off and did his thing. He did a very successful thing for a long time based on his unauthorized autobiography. It was called X-Ray. Great, interesting book. He turned that into a one-man show that eventually got to be called Storyteller. which was the inspiration for the VH1 show Storytellers.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He was the first episode of that.
Oh, wow.
And so if you watch every episode of Storytellers, there's a special thanks in the credits to Ray Davis because he did the very first episode of telling stories and then singing songs and kind of set up the format for that. And I believe there was actually a line in the actual episode where he said, VH1 is probably going to take this idea and then run with it and make $1 million off it. And it turned out that show lasted like another 20 years.
And he was right.
And then, of course, Dave went off and did his own solo thing, had a bunch of great solo albums, toured around the United States, especially where he was based, did some shows in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. They both have had successful divergent paths since then. And I imagine once you have that kind of success on your own, it makes it even harder to come back together because then you're like, well, who's really going to be in charge? Who's really going to be running the show? Who is our backing band going to be? You know, is it going to be Ray's backing band? Is it going to be Dave's backing band? Is it going to be some combination of the two? You know, so it's the same old story for a lot of rock acts that kind of have two very creative people in the band who might have different views of what the music should be.
All right, Chris, let's finish with a rapid fire series of questions here.
Right,
okay.
Let's do it.
All right. Favorite Kinks song?
It's really hard to say, but I'm going to be basic. And today I'm going to pick Waterloo Sunset.
Okay.
The last time I was in London a couple years ago, I stood on Waterloo Bridge around sunset and I played the song on my phone a few times. And it was a very emotional moment for me. So
that's awesome.
I'm going to pick that one.
Awesome. Okay. Favorite Kinks album?
Tricky to pick one, but today I'm going to say either the Village Green Preservation Society or the Muswell Hillbillies album, which was the Kinks' segue into sort of folk rock, country rock. Every song on both of those albums is just brilliant. I mean, there's no songs on either of those that I ever skip.
All right, most underrated Kinks song. I have my pick. I want to see.
All right, let's hear your pick first, Eric.
Okay, I'm going to say Around the Dial.
Oh, that's a great one.
Love that song.
Mm-hmm.
Love it, especially because I was a radio guy, so it had a little personal touch to it. So that's my vote for most underrated Kinks song. What do you got?
Yeah, it's a great one. I mean, again, hard to say. I think the underdog status of the band in the rock world makes a lot of their songs underrated. But if I had to pick one today, I would say Better Things. It's a great song from
what a great song.
The early 80s. It's an uplifting song. It's fun to sing along to. You'll catch me in the car when it comes on, just rocking out. And nobody else, hopefully, is watching me do that.
Most underrated Kinks album.
Again, I mentioned that I've been a fan since the 90s. I kind of have a different view of some of these things. And I think the last couple of studio albums that the Kinks did, UK Jive and Phobia, have some great songs on there for a band that had been making music for 25 or 30 years at that point. I mean, Phobia especially, is chock full of these themes about the burdens of modern life in a world that's spiraling out of control. And that might be even more relevant today than it was 30 years ago. Things were crazy 30 years ago, but it feels like they've only become infinitely more crazy since then.
And always be careful, just because an album may not do well in the charts doesn't mean that it's not a good album, because that's just a lot of time. Like you say, grunge era for the Phobia album. And in 1989, UK Jive, we're talking hair band era, glam metal. All right, last one. If you were to introduce somebody who's never heard the Kinks before, what would be the perfect gateway song to play them and why?
I think you'd have to ask what their favorite music is, because one of the great things about the Kinks is that they had so many different eras. Like they had that 60s era, you know, the 70s kind of rock opera era, then like the arena rock era that you love, that you, when you found the band, you know, so
disco, Superman,
disco.
Right.
Yeah, they dipped into disco a little bit. They've done all kinds of great stuff. So if they really love Britpop, you got to say Waterloo Sunset, something like Autumn Almanac. I don't know if you know that song.
No.
Great song. It's the song that Andy Partridge from XTC said he's been trying to rewrite for his entire career. that
Oh,
he loves
really?
that song so much. Check it out.
All right.
It's one of those B-side songs that is a classic. If they like heavier rock, like you were into the Van Halen, I would pick a live version of All Day and All the Night from the 80s or 90s, where Dave Davis just like rips it up on the guitar, brings it back to that Van Halen kind of idea and flips it around and says, we kind of invented this. Like, it's great that Van Halen loves it and is making it their own, but we kind of invented this, and here's why. And if they're kind of sentimental like me sometimes, maybe you'd pick a song like Celluloid Heroes. I mean, it's a great track
Classic.
about old time Hollywood and how we all dream of being film stars sometimes. So I guess I know this was supposed to be rapid fire, and that was a really long answer.
No, that's all right.
So
there is no wrong answer. There's long answers are okay.
So maybe introducing people to the Kinks, maybe a mixtape, but I'm kind of betraying my age there. So I guess whatever the new equivalent is, a Spotify playlist might be, the way to go. But you can probably hit 3 or 4 songs that way and just get them somewhere. You hit them somewhere in that spot in their brain where it really clicks.
And you want more. I'm going to throw some more out there. Jukebox Music is another great one. A Rock and Roll Fantasy is another great one. We mentioned I Wish I Could Fly Like Superman. Catch Me Now I'm Falling. We forgot to mention Destroyer. Do It Again, you mentioned. Living on a Thin Line. That's another one. Thin
Line. Great Dave Davis song. Did you know that song almost was the theme song for The Sopranos?
No.
Yeah, weird. Because it's about the end of the British Empire, and yet The Sopranos, it was almost the theme song. Yeah.
Wow, that's from 85.
Yeah.
Living on a Thin Line. Yeah, they're just
weird.
Endless. Yeah, now you got me. I got to listen to the Kinks now on my way into work tomorrow. I'm going to just jam the Kinks.
I've done it.
Oh, this is awesome. Chris Kocher.
That was the whole point of this.
That's the whole point of it. Chris Kocher is here to talk about the book, which is out now, I believe, right? It's in stores now, or it's in the UK and then US.
It will be out in the U.S. at the end of January or early February.
Okay. I had January 31st in the U.S., but if you want to get the book now, you can get it through burningshed.com. That's where you can find the Sonic Bond books, and it's called Thank You for the Days. Fans of the Kinks Share 60 Years of Stories. And Chris Kocher, thank you for being on the Booked on Rock podcast. I hope to have you back again. We got to have a sequel to this, or maybe another fan book for a different band. Maybe.
Oh, man. I've thought about that, and I remember saying to Steven from Sonic Bond, maybe this could be a series. And
you could be like Ray with the Behind the Music series. This could be
maybe.
They'll thank Chris Kocher at the end.
He leveled with me, and he said, I don't know that I would find somebody else who would do this much work for one book.
I'm telling you.
And I said,
I would do that for Van Halen. I mean, it would be something I would love to do something like that. It's a great idea.
You and me, we should talk.
It's a great idea.
Let's get Steven on the phone right now.
Let's get
Steven on the phone.
We got Steven, if you're listening right now, Chris is talking to you. Chris Kocher, thanks, man.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you having me on the show.